The new wave bands that dominated radio and MTV in the early 80s may have smoothed out the rough edges of punk, but punk's abrasive sound and rebellious spirit were kept alive by bands in an alternative music scene.
Kiss.
During the 80s, you had a mass musical culture. It had people like Lionel Richie and Phil Collins and Michael Jackson, Madonna and Prince. But at the same time, you had an underground developing in the 80s that a lot of people feel very emotionally connected to today.
80s indie alternative rock was beneath the radar of the mainstream. Nobody knows what was going on there, and there's a lot of activity there. And it was this slow boil of really heavy shit.
On the surface, the 1980s seemed to be ruled by slickly produced pop music. But through the decade, another music scene developed underground. Its sound was angrier, grittier, and far more skeptical of commercial culture.
There's a few different versions of the 80s. There was the 80s I was living in, which was Black Flag, DOA, the Dead Kennedys, Social Distortion, Minor Threat, the Bad Brains. Then the 80s also means Michael Jackson, Thriller. It was what altitude you were flying at.
Music fans began to identify the overproduced sound of 80s pop with that decade's greed and deceptions. By contrast, the 80s alternative bands had a more emotional, elemental, and seemingly truer sound.
Drums didn't sound like drums, they sounded like explosions. And synthesizers were just all glossy and sheeny. And then you'd go to stuff like REM and the Pixies and Mission of Burma and Jane's Addiction and Husker Du, and it was much more organic. You know, guitars sounded like guitars, drums sounded like drums. It all seemed so stripped down.
Everybody just wanted to get back to the roots of music, and everybody wanted to be just raw. Raw was a big thing.
As it grew harder and harder for working people to make a living, a lot of people felt left out of the 80s party. Indie rock became a means to express pride in being an outsider and to recapture some of the ferocity of 70s punk.
The 80s for us was kind of like we didn't really like anything. And what was on the pop charts was what we were against, if you will. We were moving sort of in the shadows and sort of opposed to anything that was popular or making money or anything like that.
The audience for this alternative music was a network of disillusioned kids who cared passionately about music.
I think the disaffectedness and the alienation of it was the gas that got poured on the fire. I mean, there was these people that had no outlet, and the more they got ignored, the louder we screamed, the louder we turned our guitars up, the more of a scene we wanted to make in our own little space.
We pretty much built our following on kids who were the geeks and the nerds and the freaks, the outcasts.
We were just like all those people with all those frustrations in the audience. We're coming from them, singing to them. It was folk music. So yeah, it totally connected.
Rather than waiting for the mainstream to deliver the music they wanted, some bands and fans adopted a do-it-yourself attitude.
It was this idea that you just would not passively accept whatever was rammed down your throat by the cultural or political establishment. You would actually take an active role in your life. It was very hard to find this music. It wasn't served up to you on a platter on MTV or commercial radio and things like that. You actually had to go out and investigate to find it.
Without the advantage of commercial radio or mainstream music publications, these bands had to look elsewhere for support.
Before anyone called anything alternative, it was college music, because the college radio stations were giving a little more exposure to music that you wouldn't necessarily hear on your local AC/DC station.
Take the skinheads bowling, take them bowling.
I think a lot of those bands found their audience through college radio and mom and pop record stores.
Nobody knew about it unless you were really part of it. You didn't read about it anywhere unless you put out a fanzine.
That's how we found out about bands on the East Coast. We'd read about the West Coast bands. Ooh, better buy that record. Read about it on the flip side. It's got to be cool.
In the do-it-yourself spirit, smaller independent labels sprang up to meet the needs of this new music.
I think a lot of people started their own record companies, started selling their records, you know, from town to town, going to record stores, trading off 10 singles for, you know, $5 or something. You get enough gas to go to the next town and do that.
This ain't no picket.
It sure seemed like an exciting alternative to, you know, sort of the mainstream pop music, you know, the high gloss rock and roll show.
Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all.
While mainstream bands dreamed of MTV airplay and rock superstardom, alternative bands were emphatic on one subject. They were in it for the music.
I never had any idea of ever making money off music because we lived in a hovel, we played in grungy clubs, and we lived in a van.
We just said, Hen, you know, we're not going to get on the radio. You know, this stuff's too abrasive, and, you know, it's not aha.
Yeah, that's no sense at all!
Mainstream aspirations, radio airplay, and money were never part of the equation, ever.
Even though they never planned to be accepted by mainstream audiences, one alternative band had to face just that.
Suspicion yourself, don't get caught.
We don't live to be a critics band. We don't strive to be a critics band. We don't strive to be a band, hardly. We just kind of are here.
Formed in Athens, Georgia in 1980, REM was the first band to show the commercial potential of the post-punk music adored by rock critics and college students.
College radio really did kind of make REM. I mean, they picked up on us when all the big radio stations and all the big record stores really didn't want to have that much to do with us.
No one was doing anything like that. It was kind of irreverent and muddy and could care less, but really driving and cool.
In the train, doctor says, drive away, take a break.
Nobody can tell what the hell Michael Stipe is singing, but there was just something real about it. It wasn't slick and overproduced and packaged so much, you know. I always thought that was really cool.
By the end of the decade, REM had produced a top 10 single, signed to a major label, and graduated from the indie club circuit to arenas.
This one goes out to the one I love.
Fans of alternative music began as part of a small outsider community, but the bands they listened to would soon attract the attention of the mainstream. Eventually, they would change both the business and the sound of pop music. Coming up...
In 1987, the stock market crashed. The national debt was growing. College graduates were suddenly faced with an uncertain economic future. The resulting pessimism found its way into alternative music, where angst-fueled rock paved the way for the early 90s grunge.
By the end of the decade, young Americans were told that they would be the first generation since World War II who wouldn't do as well as their parents.
I remember getting out of high school and feeling like, well, what the hell is there for me to do?
As the decade of excess ended, alternative music was more reflective of the tone of the times than what was currently on the pop charts. The unpolished post-punk sound tapped into the cynicism and frustration of the demographic that would become known as Generation X. Although 80s post-punk lacked commercial success, many bands established devoted followings and paved the way for the alternative explosion of the next decade.
Everybody's talking about the stormy weather. What's a man to do but work out whether to see?
I think that alternative rock scene was not judged based on hit songs, based on the quantity of albums sold, but based on the intensity of the relationship between the artist and the audience.
As REM and other bands picked up momentum, major labels started to look at independent bands with interest.
It was like, yeah, maybe we should be working with majors, you know, maybe this is, you know, maybe we're bigger than all these bands that are supposed to be the biggest thing, you know.
Well, could you be the one? Could you be the one?
It started to change slowly. I mean, you know, and then it really started to get ahead of steam, and then they couldn't sign enough bands. By 87, 88, you know, the major labels had signed everybody up.
When alternative bands went to major labels, some predicted the music would suffer, but the move gave bands exposure and inspired new ones. This evolution would set the stage for the success of grunge in the 1990s.
By the late 80s, something was going to have to happen to reinvigorate rock and roll.
Yeah, at the end of the 80s, it was pretty obvious that everybody was getting sick of being oversaturated with, you know, hair bands. You know, it all started to look the same. It all started to sound the same.
You could feel it bubbling up in the late 80s as artists like Jane's Addiction and the Pixies started suddenly selling hundreds of thousands of albums, whereas alternative rock only a few years earlier was only selling tens of thousands.
In 1989, a Seattle band called Nirvana recorded their first album for $600. In the next decade, Nirvana and others would introduce the world to the powerful gut-level music that the indie scene had been developing through the 80s. In 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind bumped Michael Jackson off the top of the charts. For many alternative music fans, it seemed that they and their music had finally won.
It was more than time for that sound to be on the radio. It was more than time for that to be the prevailing musical sound.
In the 1990s, a new group of alternative bands cropped up in the wake of Nirvana's success. But true fans knew that these bands would have never gotten a hearing without the groundwork of their 80s predecessors.
Bands like The Replacements and Husker Du, I mean, they paved the road that we're all walking on now, you know?
No one expected punk to break out in the United States, but the alternative bands of the 80s channeled the energy of 70s punk and created a music whose influence reached into the next century, helping to define a generation.
You no longer need to tune to a hip college station to hear the sound of the 80s indie underground. What was considered alternative 20 years ago is now used to sell everything from cars to khakis. In the next hour, we will see how another musical movement grew from the underground to the top of the charts when we look at the decade in hip-hop and R&B. I'm Shannon Doherty, and I'll see you then.